Hello, my name is Gianmaria Griglio, I'm a conductor and a composer, and welcome to this new episode of Conducting Pills, a series where we take a repertoire piece, or a part of it, and we analyze it from a conductor's point of view. In this episode, we'll take on the first movement of Beethoven's Second Symphony, its structure, its phrasing, and of course, some conducting tips. As usual, you can jump through different sections of the video by clicking on the links present in the description below. And now, let's begin. Written between 1800 and 1802, Beethoven's Second Symphony was completed while the composer was in Heiligenstadt, same place where he wrote his famous Testament. It is all the more surprising then that such a work, so full of life, so full of joy, so full of sparkles, could come from the same pen of a person who had thought about committing suicide because of his increasing deafness. But as Beethoven himself points out in the Testament, he was bound to stay alive until he had composed everything that he was compelled to compose. He was fully aware that he had started on a new path in the symphonic world way before his groundbreaking Third Symphony. Up to Haydn and Mozart, composers had mostly written symphonies in groups of 3 or 6. Beethoven begins his symphonic journey with a single one, performed in 1800, with the idea of having a second one the following year. However, the idea did not become a reality until 3 years later, in 1803. In the slow introduction of his First Symphony, Beethoven had already started to deviate from the usual path. From the famous dominant seventh chord opening the entire symphony, to the way he presented the different sections of the orchestra to the audience. Beethoven keeps the idea of moving away from the traditional canons in his Second Symphony as well. The introduction is already much longer than any of the Haydn symphonies, or Mozart's for that matter, with perhaps the exception of the Prague Symphony, the K504, which incidentally is also in the same key of D major. Now, according to Berlioz, in this introduction, the best effects come one after the other without any confusion and always in an unexpected way. I think he was probably referring to the contrasts that characterize this work, of which we will talk about extensively. Now, the piece begins on a fortissimo, the loudest dynamic for the time, full orchestra, then the woodwinds in piano, a small crescendo, and then another piano before a sudden fortissimo, the full orchestra again. Now, these sudden changes of dynamics, which occur throughout the entire symphony, will become more and more part of Beethoven's musical language. This adagio can be divided in 3 big blocks. The first block consists of the first 12 bars, where Beethoven introduces the woodwinds first after the first full orchestra chord. And then the strings. The second section consists of another 12 bars between bar 12 and bar 24, modulates to B flat, and has a constant dialogue between strings and woodwinds. Notice how the sforzando bounce between one section and another. It's a beautiful orchestral effect as the listener is constantly poked for attention. The third and last section of this introduction, between bar 24 and bar 34, is introduced by a dominant pedal in the horns and ends with a rapid descending scale in the first violins, landing in the Allegro. But before moving into the Allegro, I want to show you one very interesting thing. This very same bar will take on a much more important role in one of Beethoven's most famous and immortal works, as what he's giving us here is a sneak peek in his Ninth Symphony. The very first theme is presented by the violas and cellos. It's a very simple motivic cell. It's repeated and it ends on a downward arpeggio, of course, in home key of D major. And then it's repeated, moved up to the fourth of the scale, the G. Drop the left hand when you conduct the opening of the Allegro. Save it for the first violin's answer. And you can use a horizontal gesture to mimic the first violin's line in a very simple and elegant way. Notice how Beethoven introduces two blocks of the orchestra, the strings and the woodwinds, and keeps them separate until the first tutti. The harmony is pretty straightforward, but what we notice again and again is the dynamic contrast. There's an enormous amount of indication written by the composer when compared to a symphony by Haydn or Mozart, for example. Most of them, as we'll learn right from the start, are surprises. And this makes the symphony incredibly full of energy and sparkles, keeping the audience and the players, for that matter, constantly on edge. In this first tutti, the motivic cell is shortened. And Beethoven often uses the material in this way, shortening it, to create a propelling force and augmenting the drama. The same thing happens in his first symphony or in the choral overture, and even before that in his first piano sonatas. There's another element that seems quite unimportant at first, but gradually acquires more and more importance. This little descending arpeggio will see different transformations, and it will become the connecting tissue between the first and the second theme. Now, traditionally, the first theme is more aggressive in nature and character, while the second theme is more cantabile. In this movement, the second theme has almost a fanfare type of character, keeping up the energy with questions and answers, and again, dynamic contrast. Beethoven exposes it once, and then answers immediately with a dramatic forte in minor key. When you get to the downbeat of the second theme, do not go down with your hands. Stay up, and it will make the sudden piano much more effective. By the way, did you notice the rhythm of those four notes? It's the same that we found in the first theme and that seemed unimportant at first. This is how Beethoven connects the two themes together and creates a relationship between them. And then we come to a sudden suspension, and the initial motivic cell is used again to speed up the music. And then Beethoven keeps suspending it. And starting it again, teasing us with the dynamics. Even the pianissimo and fortissimo changes are accelerated and transformed into sforzati. Once again, the motivic cell from the strings is used to transition into the development. Not only, but the woodwind's part that was answering the string in the first exposition of the theme is used here in reverse as a connecting tissue. And notice how Beethoven uses something that initially was a mere accompaniment and transforms its character into something much more relevant. And then we land on a progression that mixes up different elements. Which, once again, are shortened, creating more drama. And Beethoven takes us to the second theme and isolates those 4 or 5 notes. See how all the elements one by one come together and summarize the entire movement. And it's actually the first time in a sonata form movement that both the first theme, and this was normal, and the second theme, and this is something new, are developed this deeply. Beethoven is starting to rethink and rework the classic sonata form, even though he's not ready to disrupt it just yet. But this way of proceeding opens the door to the development and becoming the heart of the composition, where composers can take the most unexpected turns. A C-sharp pedal turns into a dominant chord that takes us back to the recapitulation. A recapitulation that proceeds by the Bach until we get to the very final part of the movement, the Coda. It's probably the first triumphant Coda of Beethoven. Some elements from the Exposition, some elements from the development come together and reach a real climax. Beethoven's idea is not to reach the climax in the recapitulation as he did in his first symphony, but to put it off until the end of the movement. We find the back and forth between strings and woodwinds once again. The dynamic and harmonic tensions, until we get to the real climax of this movement. It's really impossible to determine where all this energy and joy came from, considering the period in which it was written. But another thing to consider is that we are reading it through the glasses of 2 centuries of history, during which art went through an enormous amount of transformations. See, we tried to see in art what the artist was feeling. But in the classical period, that was almost never the case. Mozart, Haydn, Bach before them, they were all considered artisans who would tailor their music on the commissioner's needs or the audience will. And their personal lives were not at all relevant in their artistic production. Or were they? To what extent can we be 100% sure of this? Sure, they might have been considered great artisans, they might have had great crafts and tools to write music on command. However, none of them, like none of us, had an on-off button, a switch that you can just turn off and completely disconnect yourself from what you're writing. So this question will remain forever unanswered, I fear. And what we're left with is the amount of emotion that those same works still instill in us, even after all these centuries. It's no small thing. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button right below this video and ring the bell so that you will get notified every time a new video comes out. And let me know in the comments what kind of feelings do you get from this symphony. Do you feel more an uncontainable joy for life, or the inner rage of Beethoven becoming more and more deaf every day? I will see you next week for another episode of Conducting Pills, when we will talk about Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. Until then, bye bye.